Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Haiyan swamps the Philippines. The international media come in waves. The coverage of the disaster and what came next. Freelancers are playing a bigger and bigger role in the news coverage you watch, particularly a story like Syria. Toronto's mayor clings to his day job, but a news channel that gave him his own program cracks under the pressure and takes him off the air. And out of Africa, the typical aid video is in fact stereotypical.
Is this your first charity appeal?
It's our web video of the week. When a natural disaster strikes, coverage in the international media tends to follow a familiar arc. Journalists arrive in numbers and immediately report on the aftermath and the casualty figures. Then the focus shifts to the relief operation before the story becomes about the desperate measures taken by those affected and too often the failures of those responsible for helping them. The coverage of Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Yolanda, has followed that pattern. This was an historic storm, the biggest land typhoon ever recorded. That made it an enormously challenging story for the Filipino media to cover. And when legions of foreign correspondents parachuted into the disaster zone, they were on the air within hours, trying to make sense of the story and provide accurate reports at a time when information and misinformation were coming at them in a fast and furious way. Disaster stories also provide a window into the relationship between the news media and humanitarian organizations, which is usually symbiotic but can be adversarial. Our starting point this week is Tacloban in the Philippines, where they're picking up the pieces under the watchful eye of the global media.
Close eye on Typhoon Haiyan over the last few days.
Top dozen of all storms ever seen on this planet.
The media hierarchy of disasters is simple. It's all about how far away it's happened, how easy it is for journalists to get there, how dramatic the pictures are, and how connected we feel to the people there. So something like Typhoon Haiyan ticked all these boxes.
Journalists, the good ones, tend to go against the flow. And when there's a disaster, be it man-made or natural, you can see them taking the same roads that victims use to get out in order to get in, to tell the story in conditions that thousands are fleeing.
The biggest problem really was security and logistics. The most difficult really is logistics, really finding a way to not only be able to communicate with your editors on the ground, but also to really find ways to protect yourself, protect the gear that you have. Also technology. I mean, despite all the latest means to really send your feeds, you are still at the mercy of the power of nature and very much limited with whatever you can provide and produce.
We chartered in, so the only way of getting in was on a small plane. Got into Tacloban and absolute devastation. We had to take everything in with us. So we took in petrol, we took in generators, we took in food, we took in water. There was nothing you could rely on the ground. Touchdown in Tacloban, the airport was like something out of a disaster movie.
This was no movie. In the early hours of the coverage, the casualty figures were all over the place. At a time when the confirmed death toll was around 1,000, reports circulated that it was actually 10 times higher than that.
10,000 people in the Philippines are believed to have been killed.
More or less 10,000.
10,000 people killed.
That figure, which was eventually traced to one single policeman, was way off. Eventually, it was revised downward, but not before being reported around the world. Television journalism is often criticized for its addiction to images. The coverage of natural disasters can also be over-reliant on the numbers.
Unfortunately, death toll is still the biggest indicator of the magnitude of the disaster, which is a big mistake. And it's a big mistake because you are going to have, in some cases, disasters that they are not such a big killers in the first moment, but are going to be affecting to millions of people. And they will have rough years to come. But because international aid is attached in some cases, or international attention is attached to the death toll, they get less media attention.
What is the motivation to exaggerate the number of people dead or the number of people affected in a natural disaster? Well, that's quite simple. It's money and it's attention. And this is true for both media and aid agencies. The bigger the number, the bigger the story for the media. The bigger the number, the more likely that there's going to be more aid given for the aid agencies. But really, both sides have to be very careful, because the problem is, if this turns out not to be the case, then the news viewer feels cheated. So mistakes can happen. Often the numbers aren't accurate to start off with. But if they do turn out to be incorrect, then it's up to the aid agencies, it's up to the media to try and correct them as soon as possible to keep that trust with the viewers.
When international journalists are parachuted into a story, into a country they may not be familiar with, the challenge is all the greater. And usually, that country is hurting. Its people and political leaders are sensitive to critical coverage. CNN's Anderson Cooper landed in Tacloban 5 days into the story and reported a lack of government support for the victims.
People are desperate. People do not have any place for shelter.
And he was chastised for that by a radio journalist, Corina Sanchez. Cooper responded by pointing out that Sanchez was a long way away from the disaster zone. She was in Manila, and that paradoxically, she was too close to the story.
Ms. Sanchez is welcome to go there, and I would urge her to go there. I don't know if she has, but her husband's the Interior Minister. I'm sure she could arrange a flight.
Her response was agenda-driven, mainly because, family ties and things like that. But Anderson Cooper did an excellent job. And from my observation on social media, a lot of overseas Filipinos have really rapped about that. They thank him immensely.
As picture-driven and number-driven as disaster reporting can be, the words still matter. When the BBC's Tim Wilcox used the term apocalyptic to describe what he saw, he was advised by his editors in London to use another word. Journalists have also been questioned about describing scenes like these as looting, the dictionary definition of which is to steal goods from a place, typically during a war or riot.
Well, one doesn't use the word loot lightly, but it's pretty clear when prisoners, for example, were released because nobody was there to look after them and there was no food or whatever, there was a real law and order issue. And people who hadn't had anything to drink or eat would then go to shops and warehouses and try and access that food for themselves. Now, that is described as looting. That is looting.
You can use the word looting, but you've got to contextualize why looting is occurring. You've got to explain the situation they're in. To just call victims looters is also in many ways doing them injustice.
Evidence has emerged of looting in the Philippines.
To call the government a failure, you've got to explain why. Again, in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, those looters that have been called looters, in fact, have become just victims, really, who are in desperate situations and who had to find ways to feed their families.
And what happens is that you can really affect people's perceptions. This was seen most strongly in Hurricane Katrina, where you saw pictures of both white families and black families, and the captions of these pictures were very different. The white families were seen as fending for their families. The black families were portrayed as being looters. And that had a really big effect on how Hurricane Katrina was seen and how the survivors of Hurricane Katrina was seen. And it was a bad journalistic cliche to fall into.
1 week after the storm hit, President Benigno Aquino had this to say to the media covering the story. Use your role to uplift the spirits of the Filipino people, to find stories of resilience, of hope and faith, and show the world how strong the Filipino people are. That same day, Aquino's government reported that in that first week, it had delivered 50,000 emergency food packs to the storm's victims. That amounts to just 3% of the 1.7 million people affected. The rest have been left to rely on resilience, hope, faith, and the media to tell their story. Our Global Village Voice is now on the coverage of the typhoon in the Philippines.
During the first few days, we had to rely to international and social media to get updates on the status of the badly hit areas. Without international media, we wouldn't know the real situation on the ground, that so many families were affected, that government relief efforts were not set up until the 6th day, and that help is badly needed.
When members of, or prominent members of the foreign press call out the Philippine government and ask them why there was no national government action in the first 5, 6, 7 days, it's an embarrassment for the Philippine government. And therefore, their supporters would say that the foreign press has been too critical.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Last week, we reported on what looked like self-censorship by Bloomberg News in China intended to maintain good relations with Beijing. Now Bloomberg has parted company with the reporter allegedly responsible for that story leaking out. Sources within Bloomberg reportedly told the New York Post that Hong Kong-based reporter Michael Forsyth was escorted from the news agency's offices there on November 14th and has since left the organization. According to that report, Forsyth was identified by Bloomberg as having blown the whistle to the New York Times about Bloomberg's editor-in-chief Matthew Winkler and his decision in late October not to publish an investigative piece about links between Chinese officials and a business tycoon. The Times reported that Winkler did not want to jeopardize the company's relationship with Beijing. Winkler has since denied that he spiked that story. Both Bloomberg and the Times have had their websites blocked in China since last year, when both news outlets published articles on the fortunes amassed by relatives of top Chinese leaders. More recently, the Wall Street Journal and Reuters China have been blocked for similar reporting. Russian media tycoon Alexander Lebedyev is no longer the billionaire oligarch he once was, so now he says he will relaunch his career as an investigative journalist. Lebedyev, a former KGB agent, is going through relatively tough times because of failed investments in the banking and airline sectors. He still owns a newspaper in Moscow, Novaya Gazeta, and says he now wants to use it to expose corruption in Russia. The paper already has a reputation for muckraking. One of its journalists, Anna Politkovskaya, was murdered in 2006. Her supporters say she was killed over her critical reporting of President Putin's policy in Chechnya. Lebedyev has been quoted in the New York Times saying that he's not planning to go after the Kremlin. Instead, he's on the trail of what he calls Russian dirty money, criminals who are siphoning rubles out of the Russian economy and who, incidentally, Lebedyev also blames for destroying his bank and his airline. For the next few months, Lebedyev will have to balance his editorial duties with daily visits to the remote village of Popovka, where he'll be racking up 150 hours of community service. He's doing the community time after he gave Russians a blast from his KGB past when he assaulted a fellow guest on a talk show on NTV back in 2011. Municipal politicians in Canada's biggest city are still trying to figure out a way to get rid of their mayor. They must be jealous of the executives at the Sun TV news channel who dispensed with the guy after just one day.
Ford Nation comes to Sun News.
Toronto Mayor Rob Ford debuted his program called Ford Nation on Sun TV November 18th. There he was, along with his brother, trying to explain to viewers that despite admitting to smoking crack, lying about that for months, binge drinking, and getting caught on camera with some questionable characters, he was still fit for political purpose.
It's hypocrisy at its best, and I'm not proud of what I've done. It's very humiliating.
Sun TV, which is to Canada what Fox News is to the U.S., said the show got boffo ratings, but it dumped Ford the next day after the network took a critical pounding for giving him his own platform. Rob Ford's relationship with the media in Toronto has never been great. Between slamming into camera lenses and shooing ink-stained wretches off his driveway,
Get off the property, partner!
It's been calamitous TV in a country better known for politesse than car crash politics. Syria has become one of the world's most dangerous places to be a journalist. Since the start of the conflict 2 years ago, more than 110 media workers have reportedly been killed. As the conflict has grown more volatile, news outlets have become understandably reluctant to send staff journalists in to cover the story. That means that a lot of the reporting has been done by freelancers. Being an independent journalist is tough. The pay is low. You don't get the backing of an employer, and if you're kidnapped or wounded, it can take a while before news gets out. And in a conflict as dangerous as Syria, the number of things that can go wrong is pretty high. The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on the challenges freelance journalists face to bring you the story out of Syria.
August 2012. American journalist Austin Tice is reported missing while on assignment in Syria. Tice's reports for the McClatchy newspaper chain earned him a prestigious George Polk Award, but he wasn't there to collect it.
Oh, Jesus.
Since his disappearance, he's only been heard of once, in this video posted to YouTube over a year ago, which allegedly shows him being held hostage by Syrian captors.
It is the nature of the modern news industry today that more and more of the really dangerous stuff gets done by freelance, independent individuals, unsupported by news organizations.
We've seen so many freelancers married to the story. They really follow their subjects in an exceptional way, and we see it in the amazing material that has come through.
Syria's turned out to be arguably the most dangerous story that journalists have covered, physically dangerous. Certainly in my career, which is what, 25, 30 years.
You may have seen these images in the mainstream media, but none of the photographers who took them work exclusively for the outlets they featured in. This shot of the rebel siege of Aleppo in 2012 was taken by Mexican Javier Manzano for the Agence France-Presse. It earned him a Pulitzer Prize. These images, capturing the human cost of the conflict, were taken for the Associated Press by Spanish freelancer Manu Bravo. And The Guardian ran these photos by Spanish journalist Maisun last year. But stories like this come at a price. The latest figures from the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders show that at least 60 reporters are missing or detained in the country. Just last month, French reporters Nicolas Henard and Pierre Torres were confirmed missing. They were on an assignment that more and more staff journalists are turning down, and those on a temporary contract are relied on to tell.
I've compared freelancers in war zones to garment workers in Bangladesh. There's a demand for sneakers, and there are garment workers who are willing to be paid very little money to produce shoes in unsafe conditions. I mean, it's supply meets demand. The freelancer is getting paid, the editor's getting their story, and the public's getting their news. It's just not happening in a safe way.
In Syria, I mean, if you cover the regime side or if you cover the rebel side, in the end it's the same. You're simply a foreigner. You have nobody to rely upon if something happens.
Italian-born journalist Francesca Bori should know. Bori has spent the last 2 years covering Syria for Italian outlets. Back in July, she wrote a scathing critique on how the mainstream media treats those working on a freelance basis. She described freelancers as second-class journalists who get paid meagre wages. She wrote, "Not only can you not afford insurance, but you cannot afford a fixer or a translator. You find yourself alone in the unknown."
In an ideal world, all these things would be catered for. Freelancers would be paid a lot more money. I think there are examples of freelancers being sent into situations, into conflicts, where either they're not adequately trained, protected, or necessarily particularly well insured. It's not an ideal world because finances are so stretched, which people going to conflict zones, in Syria in particular, should be fully aware of.
It's complicated because if a freelance isn't being controlled or employed or engaged on commission, surely the industry shouldn't have a responsibility if they don't have the control. However, you then get the other side of that coin, whereby some in the news industry are very conscious of these ethical questions. However, there are others who are less scrupulous and will suggest that a freelance go there, and if the material is any good, we will take it. Which is obviously reduces their bill because you're not paying for any of the costs of the operation. You're only paying if the material is good, so that you've got no risk.
Economics has become part of the problem, as shrinking newsroom budgets and journalists losing jobs means media outlets are relying more on independent journalists. But on Syria, the industry has taken unusual steps to discourage freelancers from covering the war. Earlier this year, a handful of British papers, including The Times, The Independent, The Guardian and The Observer, said they would no longer accept submissions from stringers. The work was just too dangerous. But the freelance community does have some support from organisations like the Frontline Freelancers Register and the Roy Peck Trust. Both are London-based and offer assistance, training, and in the case of Syria, advice. Back in August, the Roy Peck Trust issued a statement asking reporters to seriously consider turning down assignments in the country.
Syria is probably the most important story on earth right now, but as important as it is, I just can't see freelancers operating there safely when journalists are a commodity and kidnappings are as common as they're becoming. It's just not possible for them to operate with any by any measure of safety.
Most of the freelancers know what it means to work in a war zone, but they're also telling us that Syria is especially difficult because it's become so volatile and it's become so difficult to find who to trust. There are so many parties there. It's become so fragmented that it's really difficult to find a safe haven in between, inside that conflict.
Apparently we're meant to be under attack.
And there are people in the industry who say freelancers could also be doing more to protect themselves.
What I think has happened as a result of the Arab Spring has been a great number of young journalists going to the Middle East to sort of cut their teeth. The problem we found is that a lot of these guys are fairly inexperienced, haven't been to conflict zones necessarily before, and lack the skills, both journalistically and, frankly, survival skills, to look after themselves.
I've heard fair criticisms that some, especially younger freelancers, do go into conflict zones and dangerous situations for the wrong reasons. I don't think that many people are jumping into something that's as violent as Syria without really thinking about it. It's not a comfortable lifestyle. You're often living with bucket showers and a lack of electricity and surviving off tuna fish and bread for a week at a time. Those conditions are not conducive to keeping people around who really don't want to be there and be doing that work for the right reasons.
So the next time you see a picture from Syria, double-check the photo credit and spare a thought for the freelancer who took it. If not for the freelancers, the lengths they go to and the risks they take, these are the stories that would go untold.
More Global Village Voices now on the way news comes out of Syria.
Freelancers are not victims of the media system. They deliberately choose to be at the front line and to live in conflict zones. This allows them to be a great resource for the newsrooms because they spend a lot of time on the ground, living in hostile environments, slowly finding the contacts they can rely on day after day. Staff reporters are not precious. I think they are simply too expensive to afford even for big media companies. But it's important that freelancers are not treated like stopgaps, exploiting them only because they have the guts to be on the front line.
Covering conflicts is always full of risks, but Syria has been especially dangerous because of the volatile and ever-changing situation on the ground, especially in northern Syria. We are aware of 10 international freelancers that are missing and their whereabouts remain unknown. Freelancers are more vulnerable because they don't have the support of a big media news organisation to look for them or raise the alarm should they go missing.
Finally, too often we see successful actors forget their humble beginnings, and it doesn't just happen in Hollywood. It seems that one child actor in Africa has starred in one too many fundraising appeals, and he's getting a little bit tired of being typecast. Last year, we showed you a spoof charity song that came out of Norway, asking Africans to donate their radiators to freezing Norwegians. That video was produced to make a point about the sometimes patronizing and misguided appeals for Africa. This one does it again with a child actor who won't mold to stereotype and the aid workers who do. It's called Let's Save Africa Gone Wrong. It's actually funded by the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and it's our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Each time there's filmmakers from overseas come down to Africa, I'm the first person they call. I've got mad skills. Wait for it. Wait for it. And that is Sad Africa.
It's my first time in Africa. And as a young mother, I'm really looking forward to meeting the children. Your father, where is he?
My father left when I was 2 years old. He went to look for a job, and he never returned ever since. So I've been the man of the house. Is this your first charity appeal?
Good. Michelle, you must stick to the script.
They have so little, yet they smile.
So you see, this is tough business, you know. Sometimes I think about quitting. But then again, It's for a good cause.
For only $9, you can make a difference in these poor little angels' lives. So please reach into your hearts and dig into your pockets, and together we can save Africa.